So Life and Letters of Paul. So when we think about Paul, this is Paul is probably the, outside of Jesus, obviously, Paul is like the rock star of the New Testament, right? We've all heard of course, we've all heard of Peter, we've all heard of John, but really, Jesus and then Paul, like that's the one. If you've heard of anybody, you've heard of Paul. And usually if you've memorized anything, it was probably either something from the New Testament, it's probably either something Jesus said or something Paul wrote, right? Those tend to be the things that we memorize. So what I want us to understand, when we look at Paul, so often we look at Paul's life, and what we end up getting is we get kind of these scattered details about Paul's life. Some of us maybe know a lot about Paul's life, some of us maybe not so much. Without looking ahead at your notes, which I see some of you have already started looking ahead at, what are some things that, before you looked at your notes 10 seconds ago, what are some things about Paul's life that you already knew about before you came to class today? Came from an affluent family. Okay, what are some other things about Paul?
He was converted on the Damascus Road.
Converted on the Damascus Road, yeah.
He was well learned, and he was one of the biggest persecutors of the Christians.
Well learned, one of the biggest persecutors of the Christians, yeah.
Christians were afraid of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were afraid. Absolutely, yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, I'm sure there are some more things, but let's look at Paul's basic background. And y'all hit on a lot of these already. But looking at his basic background, first of all, we see Paul is from a place called Tarsus. Okay, so Tarsus, and I think let me see if I can. I was gonna put a picture of Tarsus on here, a map to show you where Tarsus was, but I didn't. So later on there's a general picture, but Tarsus is in modern day Turkey. So if you know about Turkey, it's kind of that modern day Turkey area, and Tarsus was a Greco-Roman city. So you have a lot of Greek and Roman culture, and it's there in what we now call Turkey, but was Asia Minor at that time. And he would have grown up in this city that was very large for the time, very wealthy for the time. He would have grown up around Greek and Roman culture. He would have grown up in this area with a very vibrant economy, all these different ideas, these Greek ideas, these Roman ideas, kind of coming in and out of his area. So you have someone who is thoroughly Jewish. He's Jewish, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So he's thoroughly Jewish, but he's grown up around Gentiles. He's grown up around, and Gentile just means non-Jewish. That's just a general term for non-Jewish. He grew up around non-Jewish culture. So he grew up hearing about the Greek and Roman poets. He grew up reading in Greek, learning all of these different things. He grew up learning about shipping and trade because of where his city was. All of these different things, he grew up exposed to them. So you really have the kind of, even before he comes to Christ, you have Paul being kind of the perfect person to do what God's going to end up doing with him. God's going to end up using Paul to minister to the non-Jews, to the Gentiles. But Paul is this person who's grew up, yes, he's Jewish, but he grew up exposed to these non-Jewish things. So he's kind of this perfect bridge between Christianity, which is starting off, it's a Jewish sect, to the Gentiles. So he is a Roman citizen. That becomes very important if you've ever read Acts. How many of y'all have read the book of Acts? Yeah, if you've ever read Acts, his Roman citizenship becomes extremely important. And he And because of his Roman citizenship, there are a lot of ways that people have to treat Roman citizens that are different than how they have to treat others. So he's a Roman citizen. He is ethnically Hebrew. He's Jewish. So what that just means for him is, even though he grew up around non-Jews, he has this strong heritage of this Hebrew background. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. So remember, the Hebrews, what do we say? They trace their lineage back to Abraham. They're very proud of that. We have the God of the Hebrews. We trace our lineage back to Abraham. We're from the tribe of Benjamin. Who else is from the tribe of Benjamin? What important figure in Jewish history, in Israelite history, is from the tribe of Benjamin? Saul who? Saul the first king, right? So the very first king of Israel is Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. We call him Paul, but he was born with the name Saul. Who do you think he was named after? The first king of Israel, right? So he has this proud Jewish background, named after the first king, from the tribe that the first king is from. He was a Pharisee. Remember, last class we talked about Pharisees. We tend to think of Pharisees as being all bad, but that's not necessarily the case. Pharisees is a specific group within Judaism. And Pharisees, what major beliefs did the Pharisees have? They believed in resurrection, in the general resurrection. They believed in angels, demons. They believed in what we would call the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament. So they would look at the Torah. They believed in the Torah, the first 5 books. They believed in the historical books, the prophets, the Psalms. They believed all that was Scripture. Unlike the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection, didn't believe in angels and demons, and only believed in the first 5 books, the first 5 books were Scripture. So Paul, he has this strong heritage. He's a Pharisee, and he's trained by a guy named Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel actually pops up in Acts. Gamaliel is one of the people that speaks up to the Sanhedrin and says, hey, this Christian movement, if it's of God, then you can't stop it. If it's not of God, it's going to fail anyway. Just leave it alone. Now, people don't listen to that. Paul himself ignores that advice. Paul himself is one of the main persecutors, even though his teacher said, leave these people alone, because if it's of God, you can't do anything. If it's not of God, it's going to fail anyway. So Paul obviously disagreed with his teacher in that. But so Paul is a follower of Gamaliel. One thing to know about Gamaliel, he is such a well-known teacher that Jewish writings that were collected 200 years, in 218 AD, so like 150 to 200 years after this, talk about Gamaliel and things that he said. The Rabbi Gamaliel said, so the guy that taught Paul is still being talked about among Jewish communities 200 years later and written about 200 years. His ideas are still being written down. So he's kind of got everything you would expect a good and successful Jewish man to have. He's got this upbringing, he's got all these things. Yes, he grew up in a Greek city and he's a Roman citizen, but he's got the pedigree. He's Hebrew of Hebrews, tribe of Benjamin, Pharisee. And then we see education. He's highly educated, both the Greek and Roman and a Jewish education. And we see that, you're going to see that in his letters. Okay, so next thing, I just talked about this a little bit. His original name is Saul. Saul is the name that we first see him when you look at the book of Acts. He's always called Saul. Now, there is a common idea that floats around that God changed his name to Paul. That is not what the Bible actually says. If you look in Acts, what it says, what you see happen is you see Saul, he's called Saul, and then as soon as he starts ministering to Gentiles, It says, and then Saul, who was also known as Paul, da-da-da. Okay, what people start to do is they'll say, oh, well, God must have changed his name. Well, that's not what the Bible says. Every place where we see the God changes someone's name, we see it actually say that. And then God changed Abram's name to Abraham. He changed Sarai to Sarah. Jesus changed Peter's name. It's explicit. Jesus changed Peter's name from Simon to Peter. So everywhere you see a name change, Jacob, it's explicit that God did it. You don't see that with Paul. They call him Saul, they call him Saul, they call him Saul, and then a real quick thing it says, and then Saul, who was also called Paul, da-da-da, never says God changed his name. What happens is a lot of people and I tell you, the first time I ever read it, years ago, before I'd done a lot of studying, I just assumed, well, God must change his name. There's actually a much better explanation for why he starts going by Paul. Remember, he grew up, Roman citizen, in a Greek city, in the Roman Empire. He would have been given a Jewish name and a Roman name. The Greco-Roman equivalent. So we do that now. I have a lot of people we know at our school who are Korean students. They don't go by their Korean names. I have an English name. Just call me by my English name. Why? Because you want to be accepted in the culture, and going by your ethnic name is usually it singles you out. Quanisha, my wife Quanisha, she even does this, and not even change that. She just allows a lot of people who just really struggle with Quanisha for some reason. That shows Q. You can just say Q instead of butchering my name. You can just say Q. It's not an uncommon thing. What you have in Roman times is someone like Paul. He would have his Jewish name, but he'd have his Roman name. So what you see in Paul's ministry, once Paul, they call him Saul, 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 and then the first missionary journey, he starts ministering among the non-Jews, and then it says, and he was also known as Paul, and then it calls him Paul from there on out. What you're supposed to pick up on is he's ministering among the Gentiles, so now he's going by his Gentile name. He's going by his Roman name. Does that make sense?
I wonder if that's where the Catholics do the confirmation. They have to have a saint name, a religious name.
They have to have a religious name?
When they're make their confirmation, they have to have a religious name.
Yeah, I wonder why that. Yeah, I don't know the origin of that. It'd be interesting to find out what the origin of that is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How many of y'all thought that God changed Paul's name?
I did, but I know one time in our Bible study, Pastor Game broke it down the way you just said.
Okay, yeah.
And, in this thought,
Mm-hmm.
saying that he just uses because of who he was speaking to.
Exactly.
He used Paul.
Yeah, and it goes to what I think somebody mentioned this a while back, what Paul says. I think it's 1 Corinthians 9. To a Jew, I'll be Jew. To a Greek, I'll be Greek. To, whoever he needed to communicate. And that was the interesting thing about his background. God knew what he was doing when he chose Paul. Even before Paul was born, God knew, I'm going to place him in this environment. Has going to learn these things. I am going to shape him for this. And when he unleashes Paul, God has already shaped him in all the ways that he needs to shape him to be effective in that task.
It's still kind of hard to not say that God changed his name. You've been saying it for so long.
You've been saying it for so long. Yeah. And that's the thing is, again, if it'd be great if he did, it's just that's not what the scripture seems to say. Yeah.
So it was Paul that decided to not use Saul, but use Paul.
Yeah, it really seems like Paul decided, hey, I'm ministering to Gentiles now, so I'm going to go by my Greek name, my name that's of Greek and Latin, Greek and Roman origin. So yeah. So, so let's look at Paul's life before he was saved. So we kind of get that background of who he is. Let's look at his life before he was saved. So before that, we see that he encouraged and watched the execution of Stephen. That's in Acts. So if you remember in the book of Acts, you have the Hellenistic widows. What that just means is these are Jews that speak Greek and have a Greek culture. In Acts, this group of people was not being taken care of. So the apostles said, hey, we want you to appoint 7 people. Y'all pray and pick them from among you, 7 people that are going to take care of the needs of these Greek widows, these Greek-speaking widows. So they're Jewish widows that have a Greek cultural background. So when you look at this, and then those 7 men, 2 of those 7 men become very important. One of them is Stephen, and the other one's Philip. Y'all know what Philip is famous for? The Ethiopian eunuch, right? So you see, Philip is really important for that. But also, now we look at Stephen, and Stephen, once Stephen comes on the scene, he immediately just goes out there. He does a lot more than just take care of the needs and oversee the needs of these widows. He goes out and he immediately starts evangelizing and trying to reach out to people. And he goes to one of these synagogues, the synagogue of the freedmen, and he's trying to reach out to them. And then this whole big thing happens. There's this argument. They seize him. They drag him before the Sanhedrin, which is this high Jewish court. That's the same group of people that had Jesus executed, that petitioned to have Jesus executed. And then here Stephen is, and he proclaims the gospel. Man, he goes from Old Testament, and you have a whole chapter. The chapter 8 is like the whole chapter is just Stephen laying it out. And near the end of that chapter, here you have Paul. The people are going to kill Stephen, the first martyr, first person killed for their faith. I mean, obviously outside of Jesus. Stephen, and who's right there looking? Saul. In fact, Saul is watching their jackets. Now, this whole watching their jackets thing could mean that he is over. It could mean that he's just like a younger guy who's just like, man, I'm younger, I'm starting out, so I'll watch your jackets. Or it could mean that he's someone that already has authority, and he's like, y'all are going to do my dirty work, and I'm watching over you. We're not really sure. Either way, we see very quickly that he goes from being the guy that watches the jackets, watches the cloaks as people stone Stephen, to being the guy who actually is going out, taking people who are Christians, who are proclaiming Jesus, and dragging them out of their homes. Now, again, focus on these Christians who they're dragging out of their homes. These are simply other Jews. These are other Jews. These aren't Gentiles. These are other Jews who their entire life have followed Judaism. But when Jesus comes, they recognized him as the true Messiah and said, we're going to follow him because he's the true Messiah. And Paul is repaying that by coming in, arresting those people, dragging them out of their homes to go and be punished and to be arrested. Now, it does not explicitly say there that Paul murdered anyone, but the level of guilt that he expresses later, as a persecutor of the church, it seems you can kind of infer that he was complicit in some people being killed for the faith, people being martyred like Stephen. So you have him doing all this, but then just persecuting Christians in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem isn't enough for Paul. He specifically goes to the high priest and says, hey, give me permission to go to Damascus, to a totally different area, to persecute Christians there. So get your idea here. You have this person who has this background. He has like the rock star background, like set up for success. Best teachers, seems to be from an affluent family, highly educated, like he has it all going. And here he is, and concerning like zeal, and he actually says this, if y'all talk about zeal of people who are dedicated to Judaism, I was, because look, I was chasing after I was attacking Christians. He was trying to prove just how dedicated to Judaism and that religious order that he was. To the point where he says, I'm not even satisfied with just getting Christians here. I've got to go seek them out and get them there. And we see him go. The high priest gives him permission. He sends him out to persecute Christians in Damascus, authorizing him to arrest Christians in Damascus and drag them there. So again, these are other Jews who have professed faith in the true Messiah. So, looking at his conversion, and this is where a lot of us kind of know this story, from Acts 9. So Paul he's on his way there, and then all of a sudden there's what? This blinding light, right? There's this blinding light. He can't see anything. What is that? What does Jesus say? Y'all remember? Yeah, Saul, why do you persecute me? Yeah, why do you persecute me? Right? And what does Saul say? Who are you? Like I'm persecuted. Who are you? How am I? Because Paul's like, I've lived my whole life following God. I've lived my whole life. How am I persecuting? Who are you? How am I persecuting? I know Jesus Christ. And you see right there, Paul realized, oh my goodness, these Jews that I have been persecuting, remember, they're not called Christians at this point. They're just disciples, the people who follow the way, people who are following Jesus. And like, this group of people, these other Jews that I'm persecuting as if they have turned their back on God, they're the ones actually following God. Think of that realization. You've dedicated yourself over, we don't know, probably maybe a year or two. We don't know how long Paul's been persecuting Christians. You've dedicated your life to persecuting these people, only thinking that you're doing God's work, only to find out this whole time you were persecuting and harming the people that are following God. I mean, this is just a devastating realization. So he's temporarily blinded. Eventually, there's a story about Ananias coming, baptizing him. The people are all scared of him because why did he come to Damascus, right? He was coming to kill him, right? So he is baptized, and then immediately, what does he start doing? He starts preaching, right? And think about that. Think of that radical shift. He came to Damascus to persecute Christians. He gets to Damascus, and he's trying to make Christians. Think of that shift. Like you see God do this radical transformation in his life. And it's pretty incredible. So
he started preaching right away. You said immediately after?
I
thought he went to be learned of God, to be learned and to be taught for 3 years. And then God gave him that apostleship title.
Right. That seems to happen right after this. So he immediately starts preaching, is what Acts says. He immediately starts preaching. And then he immediately starts preaching, and then they try to kill him. And he has to get lowered down outside of the city gates in a basket to get away. The being trained in Arabia seems to happen after that. So what happens that a lot of people in Acts kind of don't get is in Acts, first of all, Acts is giving you like 30 years of history in like a really condensed. So you may not realize that a lot of time has passed, but actually years have passed. So that's one thing that's difficult with Acts. where what you're talking about of 3 years in Arabia, that comes from one of Paul's epistles, one of Paul's letters, and we'll get to that, talking about his letters and that information. When we get to that letter, we'll talk about that. But what you see is between the time that you see kind of a general outline of his life. You see he immediately starts preaching. They try to kill him. Even the Christians kind of don't want to have anything to do with him. Then maybe some time passes. Maybe he ends up at some point he ends up in Arabia for 3 years, learning from God. And then we're going to see him try to go to Jerusalem and speak to the apostles. But in order to do that, Barnabas actually has to introduce him. No one wants to touch Paul. They're terrified of him. They don't believe that he's genuinely converted. But Barnabas saw that change. So Barnabas seeks him out. Barnabas is the one that makes introduction. So a lot of times we think of Barnabas kind of as a sidekick to Paul. But that's not really what the Bible tells us. The senior partner in that relationship was Barnabas. Barnabas was the senior partner. Barnabas pops up in Acts as a person who Barnabas is not his actual name. It's Levi. I can't remember his actual name. Barnabas isn't his original name. He's given the name Barnabas, son of encouragement, by the apostles. He's one of the first ones to sell all of his property. Again, you can find this in Acts. He's one of the first ones to sell all of his property and give it over to the Lord. Barnabas is son of encouragement. He is someone that the apostles have built this relationship with, and he is already kind of this powerhouse among the early disciples. And then God uses Barnabas to build a bridge between Paul and the apostles. Barnabas seeks out Paul. Barnabas introduces him to the apostles. So,
the way Acts is like, I don't understand why they put it there. Because it doesn't flow. It's like with Paul's letters. I'm thinking he's free, but he's actually in prison. He's about to die. And how did you write this letter after he was dead?
well, he doesn't.
Is that order thing again?
Right. So the struggle, and we'll talk a little bit about when they were written. New Testament scholars there's always a bit of a debate about how things are ordered in Acts and in the letters. Because the reality is that Luke doesn't seem to make a big deal about the letters. Some people argue that Luke didn't even know the letters existed. Some people argue that he knew they existed, but that he really didn't kind of want to emphasize that part of his ministry. So the letters of Paul begin to be a big deal fairly soon. They begin to be a big deal. But understand, if we take an early date for Acts, say Acts is being written in, say, 62 AD, if you take an early date for Acts, then it's pretty reasonable that Luke knows about Paul's letters, but that they're not as big of a deal as we think they are, maybe. Or maybe they are a big deal, but not so big of a deal that he feels like I need to. And then he was here and he wrote this letter. So what that makes it hard for us to do is to place, okay, where was he when he wrote this? Or where? Luke kind of gives you a thing, but Luke is not trying to give you as much of a timetable. He is saying things like, and then he spent 18 months in Corinth. He spent 3 years in Ephesus. But he's not saying, and then he wrote 3 letters from here, 2 letters from there. To be honest, during Luke's lifetime, there were probably a lot more than the 13 letters that we view as scripture floating around that Paul had written in churches. God, through his divine intervention, preserved those 13. But there are probably a lot more letters floating around that Paul had written because he's writing letters to all of the different churches, right? So, if we look at ordering, it's always difficult. And I think your textbook actually kind of has a breakdown of, okay, based on Acts, when are these letters written? But reconciling the letters with Acts, sometimes hard. Where do we place these letters? Sometimes it's a challenge. It's difficult. So if we look at Barnabas, Barnabas was important, but we see a shift. Eventually, somewhere in the first missionary journey, we see that relationship between Barnabas and Paul starts to shift, where Barnabas, usually you see Barnabas and Paul, and then the second missionary journey first missionary journey starts to shift. It becomes Paul and Barnabas. And then Paul starts to become the one that becomes the focus. So you see Barnabas as being this kind of figure that introduces and even starts out ministry with Paul, but then they're eventually going to part ways and Paul becomes the focus. But again, Barnabas is mentioned in some of Paul's letters. Well after, the break between Paul and Barnabas. So you have a break. There is a break between Paul and Barnabas in the beginning of the second, what we call the second missionary journey. Some people don't like calling it the second missionary journey. But there's a break between the two of them over John Mark, right? There's a break between the two of them over John Mark, who was whose cousin?
Barnabas' cousin.
Yeah. So, cousin or nephew? I don't remember. I think it's cousin. Yeah. I'm starting to second guess me, but I think it's cousin. So you see this break, and there does seem to be a restoration. So you do see seem to see a restoration in a couple places. We can tell that. Okay, so you see Paul probably between his conversion and that first missionary journey. You actually see probably maybe 15 years taking place there. So there's a lot of time here after his conversion before you see Paul doing what we actually know him for. So most would say that Galatians is probably the first letter that he wrote, and he probably didn't write that until about 48, 49 AD. So that's probably 10 to 15 years after his conversion. So the first missionary journey is, before the first missionary journey, what we have Paul and Barnabas are in Antioch. They're in Antioch and they're teaching, they're ministering there. They are ministering there as partners, ministering among the church at Antioch, which is a mix of Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. Eventually, they're going to go to Jerusalem to help out the Jerusalem believers. Then people get to know him even more. He comes back to Antioch, and then they're sent from Antioch. God sends them on their first missionary journey. And then you start to see a pattern. He's going to go on a series of these missionary journeys. Acts talks about 3 missionary journeys. Church history tells us there were probably some more of these missionary journeys. That took place after Acts, but before his execution. So if we look at this pattern, as Paul goes in his ministry, there's going to be a pattern. The pattern is he's always going to go to the Jews first. He goes to the synagogue. If there's not a synagogue, he goes to where the Jews go to pray. He tries to reach the Jews first. Jews reject him, so then he goes to the Gentiles. Why is that? Because Paul never gives up on his people. And in fact, in Romans, if we're able to get to it today, in Romans you even see that. He says, I would be forsaken. Like I would rather myself be accursed and totally separated from God if my people could come to know him. He never gives up on his people. And that's important because he gets accused of that. In fact, he's going to, in near the end, that climax of Acts, when he gets arrested in Jerusalem, that's the accusations that you're turning your back on your Jewishness. You are telling Jews to not get circumcised. You're telling Jews not to follow the laws, not to do any of that. There's this real controversy of you are turning your back on your people. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's not what Paul's doing at all. Paul loves his people. Paul's a Jew to the end. Paul is a Jew. What Paul is saying is when Jesus is the Jewish Messiah that we as Jews have been waiting for. So when he goes, where does he go? He goes to the Jews and he says, hey, your Messiah has come. You've been waiting for him. You've been reading about him. You've been hearing about him. He's here. And they reject him. So what does he do? I'll go to whoever will listen. You know what? Hey, Gentiles. That Messiah that came, yeah, he's the Jewish Messiah, but guess what God has done? This time, God is not just about saving the Jews. He's about saving you too. That Messiah is not just the Jewish Messiah. He's all of our Messiah, and God brings you in. Yeah, exactly. So we see he goes to the Jews first. In fact, in Romans, we see that. He came to the Jews first, and then to the Gentiles. And we even see that worked out in Paul's ministry. He goes to the Jews first, and then he goes to the Gentiles in his ministry. So
the same passion he had for killing them is the same passion he had for saving them.
yeah,
Sounds like it.
yeah, exactly. I mean, you that same passion we see, and
But he was adamant about killing them.
he was adamant. He was adamant about his
He allowed them to
persecution.
get 'em.
He was adamant about his persecution of the church, and he took that fervor, that same level of fervor that he took. He turned towards reaching people, trying to reach people with the word of Jesus. So we see his primary impact is not going to, even though he tries to go to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, and he repeats that pattern over and over again. His primary ministry, his primary reach is to non-Jewish people, Gentiles. But he still reached some Jews. We still see him reaching Jews. So we have to be careful because what will tend to happen is we'll think of this hard line of, okay, James and Peter are the apostles to the Jews, and Paul and Barnabas as well, and Silas with him, but Paul is ministering to the Gentiles. And it's hard break. No, that's not what we see. Now, generally, James and Peter's ministry tends to be more focused on the Jews. Generally, Paul's ministry tends to be more effective towards the Gentiles. But there's not this hard break that we sometimes see people try to make. Well, Paul just reached the Gentiles. No, Paul reached out to the Jews. When in Romans, Paul flat out says, when they say, oh, has God rejected his people, Israel? And he says, no, I'm Jewish. No, he hasn't. I'm Jewish. So we have to be careful not to have this distinction to say that his ministry was only to the Gentiles. Yes, those are the people primarily affected. But if we look at his ministry, if we look at Priscilla and Aquila, two of the people that right there with him, what were they? Jewish. If we look at Timothy, he's half Jewish. So yeah, he has people like Luke and Titus who are Gentiles who work with him, but he also has people like Priscilla, Aquila. Apollos seems to be Jewish. We look at these different groups, and clearly he's not working just with Gentiles, although that is his main reach. Those are the people he's mainly reaching. So, controversies, and I've kind of hinted at these a little bit. Just looking at some of the controversies that he dealt with, we see many people accuse Paul of rejecting the Jewish law and telling other Jews to do so. Okay? Now, there are a lot of well-meaning preachers who will preach from Romans and preach from Romans and preach from Galatians that will kind of find themselves not even really intending to, but kind of seeming to indicate that Paul just totally rejected the Jewish law. That does not seem to be the case. He does not totally reject the Jewish law completely. That's not what he's saying. If you look in Acts, they directly say, people are saying that you're rejecting the law and telling people not to circumcise their kids. And Paul's like, no, I'm not. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm doing here. And they say, well, prove it. We've got these people that need to take a vow. You go with them to the temple and you pay for this Jewish vow. And that's going to prove that you're doing this Jewish practice, so therefore you haven't turned your back on the law. And that's where he gets attacked in Acts. So what we have to be careful is there is this controversy where people, because of Paul's closeness with the Gentiles, people would accuse Paul of saying that Jews who accepted Jesus no longer needed to follow, that they should just reject the law altogether. Okay? Understand, if we look closely, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, if you are a non-Jew, if you are a Gentile, you do not have to become Jewish to be saved. If you're a Jew, then hey, by all means, continue to follow those Jewish practices. What does he do with Timothy? He circumcises Timothy, right? Why? Because Timothy is half Jewish. He's ministering among Jewish people, and he has that Jewish heritage. So you have the Jewish heritage. Let's get you circumcised. Why? Because you have that Jewish heritage. Paul is not saying that Jews should totally turn their back on the law. Now, he is saying the following the law does not save a person. He is saying that salvation never came through the law. Salvation has always come through faith. Abraham would say, by faith, salvation has never come. But he's not saying that that's a unique thing that's just now. Some people will preach this as if, oh, well, you see, now that Jesus came, it's all about faith. That's not what Paul says. Again, we don't have time to dig into because he says it in Romans, and we don't have time to dig into it. But really, he said, look, and he says it in Romans, look, Abraham was saved by faith. Salvation has always been by faith. Yes, as Jews, we are a peculiar people, set apart, so we have these laws that are meant to show us our need for faith in him, but we were never saved by faith. We were always saved we were never saved by law. We were always saved by faith. Okay, so this controversy, this idea that Paul is rejecting the Jewish law and telling Jews to do so, no, Paul is not doing that. Paul is saying salvation is by faith, and you do not have to become Jewish in order to be saved. So, kind of goes to the next controversy. Many people objected to Paul's decision to evangelize Gentiles. They objected to Paul's decision to evangelize Gentiles, and they believed that that a Gentile needed to become a Jew. That means to get circumcised and follow the law in order to be saved through Jesus. So you got to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. That was a primary argument. So if you read Acts, you have Acts 15 that focuses on that. Here they are doing all this work to reach Gentiles with the gospel, and then a group of Jewish people from Jerusalem, Jewish Christians from Jerusalem come in and say, hey, all y'all Gentiles. Ooh, I'm glad that you've accepted the Jewish Messiah, but the Messiah is Jewish, so you got to become Jewish in order to be saved. And Paul is like, whoa, no. God has opened things up so that the Gentiles can come in. But But these Jewish practices, the law is for the Jew, but God's opened it up for them to come in. You don't have to become Jewish to be saved. Because that was the idea. When he says things like the people of the circumcision, and as we go through these letters, you're going to see that pop up, that of the circumcision, get circumcised. That is shorthand for becoming Jewish. So when they say be circumcised, a lot of times we're like, man, why are they all about just cutting the foreskin? What's the deal with that? That is just a really quick way of saying you're becoming Jewish. You get circumcised, you're becoming Jewish. So when he says, you people who get circumcised, it's like Jesus is of no effect to you. What he's saying is, you have decided that an ethnic identity of being Jewish is what's going to save me, not my faith in Christ. Your faith in Christ, you're saying your faith in Christ isn't enough. He's like, but guys, the whole point has always been faith. It's always been by faith. Again, he's talking about Gentile believers. So, if you're Jewish, sure, circumcise your kid. Be circumcised. Follow the law of your fathers. Fine, as long as you recognize that that's not what saves you. It's faith in Christ that saves you, and that's what it's always been based off. It's like, but if you're a Gentile, why would you don't need to, you're not, there's no command for you to, why would you be circumcised, try to become Jewish? Why? Faith is enough for you. And if these false teachers come in telling you that you've got to become Jewish in order to be saved, they're selling you a bill of goods, and I wish they would just go mutilate themselves. By the way, that's all in Galatians. He's really angry in Galatians, and we'll get to that. Any questions about this before we...
So what happens to the women? Because, so how do you become saved?
It's right. So for the women, it's a whole lot easier, right? There are a whole lot more women Jewish converts, I would imagine, than there were men converts to Judaism. With Judaism, a woman would simply follow the law, so she wouldn't have to be circumcised. The primary, so for men, it required circumcision for men, but for women, conversion was a lot easier. So what you end up having actually at this time is within Judaism, you have three groups. You have Jews, people who are born Jewish, that ethnic religious identity of Jewishness. Then you have people who were born Gentiles, but converted. Okay? Men and women. If you're a woman, it's just easy. You just start following the law. Start following those practices. If you're a man, circumcision. The idea is the man is the head of the household. He's circumcised. Obviously, everybody else under him is now Jewish as part of that. So circumcision, those people were called, starts with a P, it was our vocabulary, proselytes. Yeah, or proselytes. So you have I always add that T in there when I'm not supposed to. Proselytes. So you have people who were born Jewish, you have people who converted to Judaism, proselytes, and then you have a third category. And these are people who are called God-fearers. If you read Acts, it pops up a lot. God-fearers. Cornelius is a God-fearer. When it says he's a man who feared God, we just read that and just think, oh, look at him, he feared God. No, that's an actual designation that everybody in the Jewish context would have understood. A God-fearer is a person who is sympathetic to the teachings of Judaism, who cares about that, but has not gone that extra step of getting circumcised. So these are people that they believe that the God of Israel is the true God, or they're starting to feel that way. They have great respect for the God of Israel, and they're maybe going to synagogues trying to learn about them. But you had a question?
3 sets of what?
3 categories of, how would we say this?
Identified as a Jew.
Yeah, three categories of Jewish adherents, people who were adherents to the Jewish faith. Really, three categories: people who were born Jewish, people who converted to Judaism, proselytes, and then people who were God-fearers. That means they had respect for the Jewish God, for the God of Israel, but they had not converted. So that's important to Paul's ministry. The whole God-fearer thing is important to Paul's ministry because notice he would go to the synagogue first, but then he would leave the synagogue, and then usually after that you'd have a whole lot of Gentiles come. What Gentiles do you think were the ones that were starting to come to him? Most likely God-fearers. It was people who, man, I'm really intrigued by this, but I don't know if I'm so that I'm going to get circumcised. I don't know if I'm that much into it. So we have
But wasn't
just
that
that's
the
going
order,
on.
when we start talking about order stuff, that God said he came for the Jews first?
The Jews
Then the
first,
Gentiles.
then the Gentiles. Yeah. But understand, in their mind, if you get circumcised and begin to follow the law, you are Jew.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets cloudy. We tend to, in our culture, we tend to think in terms of an ethnic identity as like a racial type identity, right? But in their mindset, it's different. So you may have two Jews that look totally different. Racially, they may look different, but they would consider them both equally Jewish. So say I converted to Judaism. Me and my whole household converted to Judaism. Did the circumcision, did everything, totally converted. Well, I'm for all intents and purposes, I'm Jewish. So now my ethnic religious identity has now changed. I'm now Jewish. Like think of it like changing citizenship. If you change citizenship. For all intents and purposes, I'm now Jewish. So my kids are going to be Jewish. And if they marry other people who are Jewish, the race doesn't matter. Their Jewish identity, again, in the ancient world, race just wasn't a big deal, by the way. Not in the way that it is or has become over the last several hundred years in the United States. For them, what was most important? That ethnic religious idea of Jewish. Now, if you were just a God-fearer, like you see, Peter doesn't even want to go in the house of Cornelius. I ain't even supposed to be in your presence, but I'm here because the Holy Spirit told me to come. And you can look at that in Acts 10 and 11. But looking at these things are all going on in the context of Paul's ministry. Okay? I'm really going off on tangents here, but this information does help you to understand kind of the background of what's happening here. So a lot of these early converts of Paul are probably God-fearers. They're Gentiles who have heard about the God of Israel, who have been learning, maybe been going to synagogue a little bit, if they're allowed to. So who are his primary opponents? So we see those two big controversies. He's dealing with other Jews who are claiming that he's rejected Judaism, which is not entirely true, and he's dealing with people who are mad because he's reaching out to Gentiles. Really, there are four basic opponents that he's dealing with in his ministry. These are people that are trying to fight against him in his ministry, over the course of his ministry. You have Jews who rejected Jesus and sought to persecute the church and stop his ministry. So you'll see this. He'll go from one place to another. And these Jews will follow him from city to city. And these are Jews that reject Jesus. They'll follow him from city to city, and they'll try to attack him. He's teaching falsehoods. He's doing this. They'll even start riots to try to kill him and other Christians. So that's one category of opponent he deals with. You see them referenced in the letters. You really see them in Acts. So next term, when we do the church and we kind of go into Acts, you see them referenced a lot. But really, you don't see them mentioned as much in the letters. He might talk about how he's been persecuted or how he's been beaten or how he's been treated. but he's not usually directly responding to these groups in the letters. You have Jewish Christians who sought to force Gentiles to become Jewish and follow the law in addition to trusting Jesus, rather than simply trusting and following Jesus. Again, this is, if you're non-Jewish, how are you saved? Is it by becoming Jewish and following the law plus faith in Jesus? Yeah, it's just faith. And that's his point. You will see him wrestle with it, especially in Galatians. He really goes at it in Galatians. Galatians, like, he is mad in Galatians. Like, this is a big thing for him in Galatians. But you see it throughout his letters. You see it in Philippians too. In Philippians, in chapter 3, he says, beware of dogs, beware of the evildoers, the people of the circumcision. He's talking about this group of people. He's talking about people who are coming in and they're telling Gentile believers, oh, you believe in Jesus? Oh, that's sweet. But you need to become Jewish in order to be saved. So Jesus isn't enough. And he's like, I wish they would just, these people of the circumcision, I just wish they would just go ahead and go the whole way and just mutilate themselves and just castrate themselves. That's what he says in Philippians 3. I just wish they'd just go ahead and castrate themselves. Like, just, you're all about cutting things up. I just wish you'd go the whole way. You can just see the frustration. It's like, why are you being a stumbling block to people? And he's using that strong language to make a point there. That as a rhetorical device. Next thing, we see false teachers who taught false doctrines. Now, sometimes these false teachers who taught false doctrines are the people we're talking about in category 2. Okay, so in that sense, what they're teaching is false doctrine. But the reason this is a separate point is he also, in some of his letters, he's dealing with a totally different type of false teachers. You see this in Colossians. You see it some in some of his other letters. Colossians is one place that really it kind of pops out. But you see these other groups of people who are teaching things that aren't true about God, these false teachers, and he's having to combat them as well. That it's a different group. It's not the Jewish people who are teaching about circumcision, but other groups of people who are teaching falsehoods about God. And he has to respond to them as well. And then finally, the fourth one is what we call super apostles. Now you see this very much in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, especially in 2nd Corinthians, is where he really uses that term, super apostles. These are people who came to churches. That's supposed to say Paul, that Paul had started, not Jesus. So, came to churches that Paul had started, not Jesus, that Paul had started and challenged his authority. So, Corinth is a big example. These are people who have somehow gotten letters or something from people in Jerusalem, kind of giving them this authority, and they come to churches that Paul started, and they're speaking bad against Paul, and they're undermining Paul's authority. And Paul, in the church of Corinth, has this power struggle of these people that are supposed to be Christians that are totally undermining his authority as an apostle. And Paul is like, and this is why Paul says things like, even if I didn't have the authority that God gave me, I have the authority over you. I'm the one that led you to Christ. Like, I'm your father in the faith. Even if I wasn't an apostle, which I am, I'm at the least, you're my proof that I have apostleship over you. You wouldn't even know Christ if it wasn't for me coming there. So you see this people that are supposed to be Christians that are basically challenging him, challenging his authority as a teacher, as who gets to teach and who gets to be the ones that teach in the church, and they're challenging his authority. Okay, so any questions about that? A lot. Yeah, go ahead. Ask him.
I said this is a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot. Now, that's one of the reasons we're recording it, So this is me saying hello to you later on as you watch this. That's one of the reasons we record it, because it is a lot. It's a lot of information. So what I want to do is I want to give your brain a second to relax. We don't have much time, but I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Come back at 7:30. We'll have 30 minutes to talk about. What's left here and talk about Romans. All right, so looking at Romans now. So I've been mentioning Romans. I've been talking about Romans. So now let's actually look at it. We won't have time to do as much as I would have liked, but we'll kind of catch up. It'll probably be the same way we were last time, where we're kind of splitting books in half. Maybe not able to cover everything, but we'll cover as much as we can. Looking at Romans, before we can really dig into the book of Romans itself, we need to address ancient letter writing. So, how many of you have ever written a letter? Long time ago. Everyone in here, we are all at the age where we have written a letter at some point.
Yeah, I'm probably way over the age.
But if I was writing to a bunch of people who are in their teens or early 20s, there's a good chance that answer would be no, right? They would probably be like, I send text messages.
Yeah.
I send emails. Maybe I do a video chat or whatever they're doing these days. Facebook Messenger or something like that. Inbox, Twitter, Snapchat, whatever, right?
And it's so quick, sometimes you don't understand what it is that they're trying to tell you.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of, when somebody sends different messages and stuff like that, it's like it's their own language, right? They'll use they'll use all these different things, like we've all heard LOL or whatever. I mean, my generation's at that generation where we're still kind of, LOL, all that. I can still navigate that, because that kind of popped up when I was in my early 20s, right? So I've kind of grown up. I'm 32. I've kind of grown up with these things.
Google is your friend.
Google is my friend, right?
Understand what y'all talking about.
Yeah. So
I don't know this.
when we think about, even with y'all who've written letters, my age, who've written letters, and I worked at still work at a post office, managing the post office at the seminary. We understand the concept of letters, of snail mail. You send something and it will get there in a week, maybe 2 weeks. We understand that concept. But unfortunately, that's still nowhere close to understanding letters in the ancient world. A lot of times we don't really understand the concept of an epistle, which an epistle and a letter, there have been arguments about distinctions. Really, they're basically the same thing. We don't really understand when we see the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, a letter of James. We don't really understand how that can be a letter or really understand what's going on, because letters are very different for us. So let's understand ancient letters. When you're writing a letter in the ancient world, it was not as easy as just going by Dollar General, getting some notebook paper, some envelopes, paying for a 55-cent stamp, and yes, they are 55 cents now, paying for a 55-cent stamp in order to send it. Or, hey, if you want to really get it there and you want to know, pay priority, throw it in that priority flat rate envelope, $7.35, and send it on its way. Again, I work at the post office. So it's not that simple in the ancient world. It's not that simple. So in the ancient world, sending a letter was extremely expensive. So there's a couple reasons why it was extremely expensive. One reason is the material is expensive. So when you send a letter, most likely that letter is going to be written on a parchment. That parchment is going to be made of animal skin. Okay. Now, papyrus is a common thing. Papyrus is like a precursor to what we would think of as paper. It was really common in in Egypt, and Egypt would export it all over the place. But really, the types of letters that we're talking about were probably not written on papyrus. Papyrus is very delicate. It's not going to survive as much travel. So what most likely, if you're going to come up with letter writing material, it's most likely going to be on a parchment, which is an animal skin. So that is expensive. You got to feed the animals, you got to breed the animals, you got to grow the animals, and then you kill them. And all of that is kind of lost for the skin. So now, granted, you're going to you can also get meat and other things from it, but that's expensive. That's a lot of investment for that skin. So you have an animal skin most likely, and then the ink. You don't just go down to the store and grab your ink pen, and you can get like a bunch of those big ink pens. You can get 8 to 10 of them for $1, and then you're good to go, right? No, that's not. If you needed this, you might even have to make your own ink. You might even have to go and like make your own ink and like get the right stuff and prepare it. Sharpen up your pen. Maybe you have a pen. It is a very intensive. The whole process of a letter could cost in today's money could cost in the number of thousands, from start to finish. From I'm going to write a letter, let me get my materials, to that person or church has just received the letter. It could cost in today's money what we consider the thousands, a couple $1,000s. So what we see happening here is when Paul writes a letter, typically in the ancient world, letters would be very short. Paul's letters are not short. So they're very short. Why? Because that cuts down the cost. You don't have to spend as much money on this. You don't have to spend as much money on these, on a bunch of parchment. You don't have to, you just get a little piece of animal skin, not a whole bunch of it. So have any of you ever read the book of the books of 2nd and 3rd John? Yeah, 2nd and 3rd John, the 2nd and 3rd epistles of John are very short, right? They are actually kind of on the long end for an ancient letter. Like, that's about typical. That's what you would see as a typical, like a long ancient letter kind of there. They're typically very short. Maybe they're as long as 2nd and 3rd John, but they're short. They're small. 2nd and 3rd John, if anyone ever says, go to 2nd John 15, they don't mean chapter 15. There's only one chapter. 2nd John verse 15. So, looking at this, Paul's letters, and then actually the other letters as well, are exceptional. The fact that they're so long is a big deal. It's not common. Paul's letters are arranged not in chronological order, they're arranged in order of length. Romans is the longest, then 1st and 2nd Corinthians, both the next longest, and then you see that in the descending order. So that length, Romans is very substantial, very long. It may have cost thousands of dollars of their money to produce Romans. Now, his shorter letters were probably much less expensive. So we look at these New Testament letters. They're very expensive. The materials are expensive. There's another reason they're expensive, which I'll explain here in a second. Another thing that you have, they're short, but also they're usually not written by the main sender in the way that we typically think. We typically think, hey, I'm going to write a letter. Here Paul is. Let me grab my pen. Let me get my pen, and I'm going to start writing. And I'm sitting over a desk. That's the image we have in our mind. He's sitting over a desk, and he's writing it. And maybe with Galatians, he's really writing it. Man, I can't believe you. But that's actually not what we see in Paul's letters. In one of Paul's letters, he even actually stops and says, hey, now see this part. Look how big my letters, this part that I write in my own hand, see how big my letters are. And you see, he specifically says, now stop. I think it's Galatians. I might be wrong on that. It's like, stop. Now this part I'm writing in my own hand. That's why it's so big. That's why the letters are so big, because I stopped to write it myself. This last salutation I stopped to write myself. Because typically someone like Paul, he's not writing the letter personally. He's having what we call an amanuensis, which is just a secretary. Write it. It's dictating it. That is the way they did letters back then. Now we think of that as something like, because writing material is so common, because you can just go to the store and get you some, because whatever, because of that, even 50 years ago, writing stuff was common enough that your average person could probably write some kind of letter. Literacy would vary, but you could get the materials well enough that your average person could write some kind of letter.
And then it's gotta be delivered. You didn't have a post office where you can drop it in the mail.
Yeah. I want to get there. Don't get ahead of me.
All right.
I'm gonna get there. So yeah, when you deal with letters, he's most likely written by an amanuensis. Now this is a person that's what they do. That's what they do, is they write stuff. So this is a person who's responsible for going out and getting that parchment, a person who's responsible for sharpening their pens, and yes, I mean sharpening their pens. This is a person who's probably responsible for making the ink. And this is a person who is... that's what they do. Sharpen the pen, dip it in the ink. So they use some type of stylus that they're going to then dip in the ink and then write with. So this is a person that's probably making the ink. This is a person who's very educated. So what we see happening, the idea of an amanuensis is important, because some people there's certain scholars that will say, oh, well, Paul didn't write this because it doesn't have the same style. And I'm not going to get into all those arguments. But when we see the way they typically did things was they would have a secretary, and he would sit with what is a wax tablet, what we call a wax tablet, and Paul would start to dictate, and he would be writing in a wax tablet. So we'd have like a hot stylus and a little tablet with wax on it, and he would write that in on wax, and then he would come back from that wax tablet, and then he would write the actual letter in a much more eloquent thing. Just like if you ever seen somebody who their actual secretary, they have like the secretarial shorthand, and they write it, you want me to say this, and this, and this, and this, and they do that shorthand, and then they come back later, and they actually write the polished document. So that there's like this whole process. Now, you might ask, how do we know that that's how they did it? One, that's how they always did it. Two, we have the thing I already said about Paul making a big deal about, hey, I'm actually writing this one in my own hand, which tells you he didn't typically do that. But three, in Romans, the letter we're about to talk about, if I can ever get to it, the scribe, the amanuensis, he actually says, hey, this is Tertius, the one writing this letter. Say hey to everybody there in Rome for me. He actually tells you. That's in chapter 16. He actually tells you who it is. Now the letter starts out. We know who's the letter from. We know it's from Paul. But we get to Tertius, and we get to the end, and he says, by the way, the one writing, and he means the one actually physically writing it, is Tertius the scribe. Tertius the amanuensis. So
How did that happen when he was in jail? He went to the jail, you know what I'm saying? When Paul was in prison?
Yeah. So prison is not the way that we see it. We think of prison, we think of we think of bars, and we think of these large facilities, and we think of the government pays for your food and all your stuff. No, that's not how prison worked then. You know who pays for your food when you're in prison in the ancient world? Your family and friends. You are responsible for your own food. If you sitting there in that prison, you starve to death. That's up to you. You actually would have a situation, And you can actually see some discussion of this in Acts, where he has people visiting him. In Acts, you see he has a relative. One of his relatives visits him to tell him, hey, by the way, there's a group of like 40 or so people that have made a vow that they're going to kill you. While he's in prison, he has visitors telling him this.
And he asked for his cloak too.
Right, you see that in Timothy.
Yeah.
You see that in Timothy. Bring me my cloak, bring me my parchments in 2 Timothy. You also see examples when he's writing to the Philippians. He's saying, hey, thank you for sending this person to Epaphras to come and minister to me and do all these things. By the way, who is delivering that letter? Most likely, Epaphras. He's going back. He's there. So yeah, they have people who can visit and who can do this. So you have, as the Romans, they're going to lock the where you're in prison. They're going to keep you up, and it's not in the best conditions. But people who support you. That's why what the Philippians did was such a big deal, because the Philippians actually sent Epaphroditus to come and minister to Paul and to provide for his needs. So they paid to have a person come and provide for his needs, make sure he had food, make sure he was taken care of, make sure he was able to do all these things. So yeah, he's not sitting there in prison writing. What it more is, hey, if you can afford it, you could work something out with the guards to come in and say, hey, he wants to write a letter, or we're going to dictate this. And so it would be this situation where he's there with his wax tablet. Okay, you want me to write this, you want me to write that. Yeah. And depending on the prison situation he may or may not have had, depending on how bad, he may have, in some prisons, he may have had more opportunities, and some he may have had less. It really would kind of depend on who was really in charge. And we do know that Paul had this tendency to get in good with the people he was in prison with the guards. What does he say in Philippians? Now the whole household of Caesar knows about me now. Now the Praetorian Guard, the Praetorians, the people who are like the personal guard of like the governor or Caesar, those people know about Jesus now, because here I am chained to him. Guess what? I'm witnessing. I'm telling them about him.
And just the word you just said, he's chained to them.
Right.
So that's why I would say.
Right. So what we see is in some cases that I'm chained to them may be like I'm that doesn't necessarily mean he was chained to them all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean he's chained every moment of every day. In some cases he might be. In other cases he might be chained to something. So we don't know the exact conditions. We do know that at certain times he was chained to a guard. But that doesn't mean that like every hour of every day he was chained. And the reality is again, he's not sitting here writing with a pen. So even if he is chained to a guard, then he's dictating a message. He can still dictate and be chained up. He's not physically writing, most likely. Does that make sense? Sort of?
I'll go with it.
You go with it, sort of?
I'll go with it.
Yeah, and it's going to depend. And for example, when he's in prison in Rome, it's actually house arrest.
That's where he's from.
Yeah.
So
And,
they would-
well, he's not from Rome.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, he's a Roman citizen.
He's a Roman
so they would
citizen.
treat him bad, right?
Well, in Rome, at least the first time he's in Rome, he's on house arrest. So the first time he's in Rome, he's there for 2 years, and he's on house arrest. And he's able to have a pretty good amount of freedom there in Rome. Now, the second time he's in Rome, which is where we see 2 Timothy being written, we don't actually know. Yeah, we don't really know what the conditions are like. We do know he gets killed that time. So yeah, moving on. We got like 10 more minutes. I want to finish talking about letter writing at least. When they did this, they were working with an amanuensis. They're working with a secretary who's doing the main writing. Another thing is that they were collaborative works. So let me find something. Let me find something here. For you. So, 1 Corinthians starts out this way. Paul, called as an apostle of our Lord Jesus Christ, this is 1 Corinthians, by the will of God, and Sosthenes our brother. What we typically do is we just say, well, it's from Paul. He's the first one. Paul wrote it. He's just saying, by the way, Sosthenes is with me. But it's probably, now, is Paul the primary author? Absolutely. But it would probably be wrong to think that Sosthenes didn't have some input. And it's not just here. Like we see that in a lot of Paul's letters. Now, some we see, like Romans, like Galatians, are just Paul's name on it. But we see others, like, for instance, 2 Corinthians. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. He's not adding those names just because. So he is with someone. In 1 Corinthians, he's with Sosthenes, someone they would know. In 2 Corinthians, he's with Timothy, somebody they would know. When he says this is every other book of the Bible, any other letter, if I say, hey, this is me and Quanisha, you would expect, well, maybe I'm the main one that wrote it, but at least the other person had some input. Now, if you ever get a Christmas card or a birthday card from me, and it's written in really nice handwriting, it is a safe bet to say that my wife did it. But I at least read it and said something before it goes out.
Probably
Like,
not,
what did
but
you
all right.
what did you do? What did you do? What we need to understand is that some of these ancient letters, they were collaborative works. They weren't. Now, the ones that say Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ, and Sosthenes, our brother. Now, clearly, Paul is the main writer. The main author is Paul. But he's adding Sosthenes' name because he's trying to let you know, hey, Sosthenes had some input here.
So when you look at Philippians, the first chapter,
Yeah.
at the end it said with the bishops and deacons,
Mm-hmm.
does that imply that they helped write Philippians?
So you're not talking about how it starts. You're talking about at the end of Philippians where
No,
it's
first chapter.
the first chapter of Philippians.
Philippians 1:1.
Paul and Timothy, bondservant of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, including the overseers, grace be it. So, no.
Okay.
So the overseers and deacons are the recipients.
Yeah.
I'm writing to those people. But in Philippians, Paul and Timothy. So, again, so often, because we know these are the Pauline epistles, we just think it's just Paul. Paul is putting that other person's name on there. Again, there are letters where he doesn't do that. Romans, Galatians, there are letters where he doesn't do that. But he's putting that name on there. This is my companion. He's with me. And I want you to know, like, what I'm saying is we are speaking with this voice. Yes, is Paul the primary author? Yeah. But these are most likely collaborative things where Timothy says some things. Sosthenes maybe says some things. These are collaborative efforts. So just keeping that in mind as we're looking at these. Could be collaborative works with multiple authors contributing to the final letter. Now, again, like I said, Paul is the primary, but just some other input probably. Handwritten copy is going to be made and kept by the author, so you can't just Xerox it. So these are big deals, like especially something like Romans. This is a big deal. So what you're going to have is you're going to have this. The scribe is going to make 2 copies. One that goes out, and then one that he keeps, so that he knows what the original said. Okay, so the here's the kicker, and this is what you were getting at, Ms. Nelda, is that there is no Roman Empire post office. Now, there are official things where, like for the Roman government, where they have official couriers, but that's not for regular letter stuff. That's only for like official business. So, what do you have to do if you want to send out a letter? You have to do all the writing, and then you have a couple options. Say what? You have to hand deliver it. Yeah, you have a couple options. One of your options is you happen to have someone you know and trust already going in that direction, and you just give them the letter and then they take it. Another one of the options, and this is where the letters can get so expensive. Another one of the options is you pay an individual you trust to travel to that area specifically and deliver that message. Now, that is something that's very expensive, and when this happened, typically it's someone you very much trusted. And you trusted this person to hand deliver that message, and usually that person would have the responsibility of like clarifying anything. Like if they, oh, Paul said, and it's the same thing of like, oh, how's Paul doing? Like I know he sent his letter, but how's he doing? Like really kind of clarifying. Paul says this, here's Paul's letter. Oh, okay, and actually having that business of actually clarifying if there's any questions or that kind of thing. And we see in one case, I think it's Romans, you have Phoebe is the person that hand delivers, and there's that question there. So, real quick, with our 3 minutes that we have left, this is important when we see these letters being delivered. It's important to understand that Rome, more so because of their road system and because of their road system and because of their intense shipping system, Rome, more than anywhere else at this time and most places after this time for a long time, Rome has this, it's much easier to send letters and do communication than maybe previously and really after the Roman Empire collapsed for a really long time. And the reason is because you have these roads. So you actually, it's not as hard, it's still very expensive and it's still very difficult, but so you have these letters traveling the Roman roads. You have, hey, I'm going to give it to Epaphras, I'm going to give it to Phoebe, I'm going to give it to whoever. And they're going to travel these really elaborate Roman roads. Again, here's one that survives today. Like if you go to certain parts of Europe and Northern Africa and the Middle East, you still see Roman roads that have survived. It's sometimes here in this area, if you go to New Orleans, you see roads that were made 4 years, for 4, 5, 10 years ago, and then they're like, oh my goodness, like this thing is awful. And then some of these Roman roads, 2,000 years, and they're still standing. Let's just a quick look at how big this empire is. And this is from a little later. This is from the 2nd century, but it still gives you a good idea of things during Paul's time, how interconnected they were. You see how large the Roman Empire is. It was about this large by Rome's time. You see a little bit of differences up in here and a little bit up there, but it's about this size during Paul's time. And you see all these shipping routes. So if I'm over here in Ephesus and I'm writing which is most likely where he was when he wrote 1 Corinthians, if I'm over in Ephesus and I'm writing my letter to Corinth, that's actually not that bad of a jump. Right there. Where? Ephesus, Corinth. So if I'm writing, but that's not too bad, but it's still a pretty long distance. But I'd have to hop on a ship, and I might be on a ship for a couple days, maybe a week or so on there. Or let's say I'm writing a letter. I'm writing a letter to people you're writing a letter to people in Antioch. So that's a good distance. Like this is Europe. So we have a lot of distance being traveled. If I'm in Rome, in prison in Rome, and I'm writing to Timothy in Ephesus or something like that, it's a good distance. So just understanding what's happening there with the distance of how far they're traveling. So we're going to stop there, and we'll continue this discussion as we'll actually get into the nuts and bolts of Romans. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what actually they're going through and what these letters were like.